I think there is obviously a bilateral agenda between India and Ukraine,
Yeah.
but clearly the more important part of it is going to be the war.
Welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. We're looking at the visit of Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, who arrived in Delhi on Thursday morning, early on Thursday morning. The big discussions are on Friday with External Affairs Minister Jay Shankar, and we're going to try and give you a curtain raiser as to what the visit is all about and what we can expect. I have with me Pankaj Saran, former ambassador to Russia, former Deputy National Security Advisor, and currently the head of the NatStrat think tank. Ambassador Saran, welcome.
Thank you, Surya. Thank you for having me once again. Pleasure to be with you.
Sir, the Ukrainian foreign minister is in town. A lot of speculation going on as to what he wants, what he hopes to get. Um, could you give us a sense as to where this is going, what we can expect?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's an interesting visit because of the fact that we are actually in the middle of this conflict or the war. So obviously, any Indian interaction with either of the two parties always raises a lot of discussion, and people ask what is the purpose of the visit. The last visit, as far as I can recall, by an Ukrainian foreign minister was many years ago.
Yeah.
And I was just trying to think of the pattern of visits between India and Ukraine and the pattern of high level exchanges after the February 24th invasion. And it's interesting that there have been exchanges at different levels, including through phone calls and other meetings, including at the level of the prime minister. So I would say that this is part, perhaps, of that exchange process between India and Ukraine. But for me, it's also significant because the visit is taking place almost just a week after the phone call
Yeah.
between Prime Minister Modi and President Zelensky, and also against growing chatter that we are seeing
Mm.
on the prospects of holding the so-called peace summit and other background noise about uh, going forward with some moves to reduce temperatures and perhaps shift away from the battlefield to the negotiating table. So I think there is obviously a bilateral agenda between India and Ukraine,
Yeah.
but clearly the more important part of it is going to be the war.
Mhm. There's been a lot of toing and froing. If you look back, the Ukrainian deputy foreign minister was in Delhi last year. Then we had, of course, the NSA going down to Switzerland for meeting, the deputy NSA going down to Switzerland for peace summit in Davos. There's talk of another peace summit later this year, again in Switzerland. Last year, NSA was in Jeddah for a peace summit. So a lot of this is going on, and one gets the impression that a lot of people seem to be trying very hard, but nothing seems to be happening. Is there some problem with the fact that the Europeans and the Americans, first of all, are not trusted by the Russians? And I mean, is this how it's working out?
So I think the war has gone through different phases. And in the first few months or the first few weeks of the war, there was a very serious effort by Turkey to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. And they almost succeeded. This was in the month of March or April 2022. But that failed. And that was an aborted, unsuccessful attempt at mediation. But after that, Turkey has been offering its good offices, and some other countries have also tried. There was an African peace mission. So
Yeah.
there is a whole history of peace efforts. But the point about peace efforts is that they succeed only when the parties are either exhausted, or there is a clear victor, or they see merit in going to the table rather than the battlefield. So, any peace effort to be successful requires the optimal timing of that effort. Otherwise, any peace effort would not succeed. Secondly, in the case of the so called peace summit, which was mooted by the Swiss,
Yeah.
the Russians have made very aggressive statements saying they do not
Yeah.
regard the Swiss as neutral players, and any summit or process which is driven by Ukraine will be unacceptable to them. So that's what I believe our leadership has conveyed in these meetings, which you referred to, that any agreement or any solution will have to be acceptable to all parties. Otherwise, clearly, it will not fail. But I see certain signs coming out of and hints from the Indian leadership in the last many months about India taking a slightly more forward position on
Mhm.
the whole question of the role it can play. And I think it received a big boost after the success it achieved at the G20 last year, when it actually managed something which was impossible, which was a consensus document on Ukraine agreed to
Yeah.
by all sides. So I think we are seeing more of an Indian, let's say, hand and visibility and talking up a little bit more about a possibility of getting more involved in shifting this whole confrontation to diplomacy and the
Mhm.
negotiation table. I mean, just a few days ago, Minister Jaishankar said in Southeast Asia, talking about this current visit of the Ukrainian foreign minister, he said, war does not help anyone. It is important to go to the negotiating table to leverage and use diplomacy to find solutions. So when you hear statements like this, and for me, the most important was the two phone calls made on the 20th of March by Prime
Yeah.
Minister Modi to President Putin and to President Zelensky. So I think we can see here that India is positioning itself in a certain way, which it was not in 2022, and it's becoming more overt. But yet, I don't think we should overread these efforts, because I think the Indian leadership, given our own strategic DNA, is actually very good at reading these kinds of situations and conflicts. So I don't
Yeah.
think anyone is going to rush into this, but I think step by step seems to be some move to offer and to provide certain solutions or a certain role to the sides, saying that India can be a problem, a part of the solution. So that for me is actually the biggest and the most interesting thing.
Would you say that's historic? Because generally the word mediation is not really liked in the establishment here.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I don't want to get into the vocabulary because each word has a lot of meaning attached to it.
Yeah.
And some of
Yeah.
these words are very technical in nature. But the basic idea that you need some trigger or catalyst to provide the platform for both sides or all sides to sit together. Now, in this case, what has happened is, you know, I mean, the Swiss are trying it, the Ukrainians are trying it, but the fact is that in the belligerents to the conflict can actually never be peacemakers. You
Mhm.
can't do both. You
Yeah.
can't be at war and also make peace
Yeah.
unless there is a victor and a vanquished, and then you have a peace of the honorable, and so on. So here it appears to me that since the conflict involves directly or indirectly Russia, obviously, but also the NATO and the European Union and Ukraine, are they in a position to find a solution among themselves? So far, it
Mhm.
seems they are not, because the split is real and the tensions and the feelings are still running very high. So, if you have to find someone else outside this geographical territory and zone, from the outside world, so to say, to help, then you'll have to look at what are the options? I mean, Turkey
Yeah.
was one. China came up with that proposal 12-point
Yeah.
peace plan on the first anniversary. As I said, the Africans are trying. People are talking about the global south. So here you might actually have a situation where you could have an unlikely one country or a group of countries, and you could have some kind of a kind of a peace summit or a conference comprising many countries who may actually come to the aid of the belligerents or the parties to the conflict to find some way in which to break the cycle, because the issues at hand are very difficult to square. On the
Yeah.
one hand, you have violation of territory. On the other hand, you have occupation. And on the other hand, you have the security interests of the sides. So how do you find? So one thing is to, like an armistice, you call a halt of military operations. The other is, like a ceasefire, or you say, I want to be more ambitious and find actually a formula which takes into account the principles of international law, which we are familiar with, the traditional principles, and yet takes into account, or builds a formula which can sustain over time, so that we don't have a recurrence of this after a few years.
Now, mediation is also about trust, isn't it? And I presume the Russians trust us. I mean, you would know better. Why would the Ukrainians trust us?
Yeah, I think trust is the foundation. And the second foundation is not just to be neutral, but to be seen to be neutral or to
Yeah.
be objective. I mean, we've done that in the Korean Peninsula in the 1950s, very early on in our days of after independence. So India
Yeah.
has a history. I think if you look at India itself as a country, I think our experience in peace making, peace building, conflict resolution within our own country has been second to none, because the number of internal conflicts that India has been able to solve on its own
Yeah.
has been extraordinary, whether they were political conflicts or economic or water based, or we have handled the most intractable conflicts with great success in India in the last 75 years. So we have that fantastic record. But in the case of these two, obviously, you need they will come to you and they will listen to you only if you have trust, if
Yeah.
they have trust in you, and that you are able to show good faith. It's a tall order, because suspicions are still running high.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, the Chinese have tried it. Their envoy is, traveling back and forth. He was my counterpart in Moscow when I was there. So
Mhm.
he's all over Europe. He's traveling to Kiev. He's traveling to Moscow. So they are kind of seem to be very active in Europe and Moscow, trying to see what they can do. But question is whether they will be accepted by the West in
Mhm.
terms of their neutrality and their good faith. I think we have a better chance of finding a greater Western confidence in us because of our own relations with them,
Yeah.
with Europe and with the United States. And obviously, with Russia, we have long-standing ties. But let's see how things go. Obviously, what is happening is that there is battle weariness. Uh, we are constantly on the edge in this conflict or in this war of it falling off the precipice or getting more ugly than it already is.
Yeah.
Uh, but what we are actually seeing right now is somewhat of a stalemate in a strategic sense.
Yeah.
Localized battles are happening. Not much territory is changing hands, apart from what has already changed hands or been occupied. So this is basically where we are.
Mhm. Tell me, the Ukrainians. They've been saying some nice things about us for some time. How would you describe our relationship with them?
For many years, it is true to say that we did not have very close ties with Ukraine, obviously, compared to the ties we had with Moscow. There was not much comparison. But that is also because Ukrainian capacity was much more limited. They were completely preoccupied with their own internal affairs. And in any case, India at that time was focused largely on the European Union and the larger European countries and the United States. So, in terms of, let's say, the substance of the relationship, trade, investment, etc., it was not so significant. But on the military side, for example, there was a bit of an kind of a contradictory situation where,
Hmm.
Ukraine had inherited a lot of the former Soviet military industrial complex in terms of engines and in terms of other equipment and in terms of, let's say, even the aircraft servicing and so on. So we had a situation where there were some aspects of our military procurement which were dependent on Ukrainian factories and military establishments. But there was no real difference of views between India and Ukraine on any real issue. Um, there was a phase in which Ukraine actually enjoyed fairly close ties with Pakistan and also enjoyed a fairly, uh, you know, healthy defense relationship with Pakistan. But maybe that was a reaction to the kind of relations we had with Russia.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, it was a fact. Uh, we A lot of our students studied and continued to study in Ukraine, so there was that people-to-people connection. But yes, in terms of the intensity of the relationship, in terms of the strategic convergence, it was not on the scale of kind or not of the kind we had with Russia, but still it existed.
But Ukraine still sees a need to reach out to us. Is this at Western prompting? Do you see something else there?
It could be. I mean, it could be, certainly could be, because, they also would value someone who has access to the Kremlin,
Yeah.
someone who is trusted by the Russian president, someone who the Russian president would listen to. So again, as part of this whole process, which I described earlier, I think the visit of Foreign Minister Jaishankar and his meeting with President Putin late last year, again, was very significant. And all of these conversations, we have to presume, were focused largely on the conflict. And so, if there is a situation where India has the ear of the Russian president and also enjoys confidence in the West, then it's a great asset and a great position to be in.
Where would you see the outlines of a settlement? Uh, I mean, given that Zelensky has made it clear he wants the Russians to leave the territory they've occupied, which the Russians are not going to do, it would appear that this is, complete deadlock.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I don't think anyone has an idea. We had published a piece by the one of the leading Swiss think tanks about the possible scenarios on how the conflict might end,
I see.
and he kind of described what were these scenarios, the likely scenarios. But the question is, you have occupation, which you want vacated, you
Yeah.
want ceasefire, you want return to status quo. But the other side wants some kind of security, maybe not guarantees, but a kind of a situation where this kind of situation does not recur again after a few
Yeah.
years. So the question of balancing the principles of international law as we understand them with the demands of mutual security are difficult. I mean, it's difficult to actually, uh, come out with any, formulation which can take care of all these concerns.
Yeah.
Obviously, right now, positions are absolutist on both sides, and that's pretty much in the nature of things. Uh, Also, to the extent that both sides, as long as they continue to think that they will prevail on the battlefield, or they think they haven't bottomed out in terms of national capacity and the war of attrition. So, till as long as either side or both sides believe that they can actually eventually, in the long term, prevail over the other, the incentive for going to the negotiating table is that much less.
Yeah.
So, I think timing is of the essence, and it is that little small trigger, wherever it comes from, which might actually create the conditions for sitting together. It's difficult. I mean, uh, how do you vacate occupy? I mean, look, we live through this every day. I
Yeah.
mean, Indian
Absolutely.
territory has been occupied for 75 years,
Yeah.
both by Pakistan and by China. So the question is, how do you get that territory vacated? I mean, that's the
Mm.
real issue. And then they have today in the Russia-Ukraine front about 1,000-kilometer line, an active line on which both sides are facing each other. There are different degrees of control which Russia has on the republics that they have taken over and which they have declared to be part of Russia.
Yeah.
So, these are all situations, and the point really is that the war could get dirtier than it is today. So I think if there are voices coming out, such as from New Delhi, which are more vocal than before,
Mm.
that will be good. I mean, if we keep saying repeatedly that wind down, let's go for negotiation and diplomacy, and there is you kind of generate a momentum
Mm.
on behalf of yourself, firstly, but also on behalf of the wider international community. I think that would be a great service we can do.
Last question. The UN has been singularly absent here.
Well, that is one of the takeaways when the history of the war and the conflict is written. I'm sure that this will be written about a lot in terms of what happens when the guardians of international peace and security are themselves at war.
Yeah.
So you were supposed to be the guardians of maintaining, that was the charter of the Security Council, the primary charter. But if the Security Council is itself dysfunctional, then how do you deal with such threats, which and such conflicts, which involve, in one way or the other, the most powerful militaries on the planet, nuclear armed, the richest countries that we have. So the UN is completely absent, and this is a big risk for the future and a big lesson for us on how we, on for everyone. I mean, for the whole world, because it's come out in the open now that the UN and the Security Council, apart from a couple of resolutions, especially by the General Assembly, which actually
Yeah.
do not have any more weight except moral weight,
Yeah.
has not been able to, even the grain deal, which was brokered by Turkey, the Black Sea grain deal, only had UN presence, but the trigger and the catalyst for that was not the United Nations.
Well, that's the realities of our time. Ambassador Saran, as always, great talking to you. Great perspective. Thank you very much. And let's see what the Ukrainian minister's visit produces.
Thank you so much, Surya. All the best. Thank you for
Thank you,
having
sir.
me. Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
That's all we have for you on StratNews Global. And do follow our website, follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Goodbye.